Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. So today we would like to just provide an overview of strategies you can use when planning a research program. And so my name is Anna. I'm a Strategic Research Development Officer at UTM's OBPR.
And I'm Stephanie, also a Strategic Research Development Officer at OBPR.
So we would also like you to know that the session is being recorded, and the recording, I think, is going to be shut down for the Q&A. So we have already done the land acknowledgements, so I will move forward. And I just want to start by discussing and providing an overview of the types of funding available to researchers at UTM. Funding can kind of broadly be categorized into 4 types: government funding, funding internal to the university, nonprofit funding, and private sector funding. And I took a quick look at some of the funding that was being held by UTM researchers at the moment, and I provided some examples. So the one that's most common is tri-agency funding, and the tri-agency is made up of CIHR, NSERC, and SSHRC, and we will go over those in more detail in the next slides. There are also joint tri-agency programs, such as the New Frontiers in Research Fund, or NFRF. There are other federal agencies, such as CFI. And then there are the provincial funding sources, such as the Early Researcher Award and the Ontario Genomics funding sources. Funding can also be or come from the municipal level. So some researchers hold funding through Metrolinks. And so in addition to the government funding, there are internal funding sources. So UTM offers many sources of funding through research planning grants, grants that provide in-kind and matching contribution for other funding opportunities. U of T itself also has grant opportunities, such as a Major Research Project Management Fund, which provides funds for grant development and hiring a project manager. There are also many nonprofits that provide funding to researchers. So examples include the Cancer Research Society, the CONOC Fund, which is administered through U of T, but is considered a nonprofit. There's the Crest Foundation, which provides funding to humanities scholars, and the Sloan Foundation, which is mostly science focused. And finally, there's private sector funding, which usually comes through research contracts.
Okay, so in that larger landscape, Anna talked about the tri-agency. So it's basically federal money that's funneled through these 3 different agencies based on the mandate of your work. So you have CIHR, which is health research, biomedical studies, human health, clinical studies, population health, anything that really relates to health is funded through CIHR. Then you have NSERC, and their definition is a bit more vague. It's just research within natural science and engineering, but you can think like chemistry, physics, math, biology, as long as it's related to the healthy state, is fundable by NSERC, as well as obviously engineering. And then SSHRC, which is a knowledge of individuals, groups, societies, how they interact with each other, as well as the world around. So before we go any further, I just wanted the rest of my slides anyway, get a bit more specific on the 3 different agencies. Do you want me to go through all of them, or do you want me to stick to, like, does anybody here want to know about SSHRC? I mean, CIHR? Yeah, NSERC? Yeah.
SSHRC?
Okay. Yeah, SSHRC definitely, but I was just wondering about the other 2. We should go through them. Okay, so when we think about Tri-Council, I wanted to start off just why they're important, why you should consider applying for them. And it's kind of 2-pronged approach here for the importance. So first, to the individual, Tri-Council is kind of like a stamp of approval on your work. It's known countrywide, you know, any institution you go to, they'll know of Tri-Council. It's peer reviewed usually by a committee of experts. So if you are able to get a Tri-Council grant, it kind of says to the external population that my research is sound and, you know, I have a good thing going here. So it just, again, it's kind of like a stamp of approval on your work. As well, like I said, most tri-agency grants go through external peer review, and it's usually a committee of experts. And so it's a good way for you to kind of silently network within your mandate, within your discipline. When you're submitting high quality work, your name is recognized, your work is recognized, and it's a good way to kind of network by not really networking. you kind of know what I'm saying here. It's a silent way of networking. Also, there's importance to the institution. The more tri-agency funds that we get determines how much we get back in something called the Research Support Fund, which kind of just, maintains university, the space, the research support staff. It's kind of just keeping the lights on. So this really funds the university and helps us to be, to get really good things on campus. As well, it determines how many CRCs we get, how many trainee scholarships we get, as well as institutional funding for like some of the institutional short campaigns. It also determines, or it kind of says to the external community that we are a research intensive university. So good things coming from Tri-Council grants. And when you start thinking of applying for Tri-Council, there's a few things that you want to think about. Firstly, even more before you start applying, think about building up your peer review work. If that means articles or book publications, just something that gets reviewed by an external committee of peers. Something that you can show to Tri-Council that, my work has been vetted by others will help you in securing Tri-Council grants. Additionally, not just for Tri-Council, I think this says a lot to awards, to scholarships, to grants, but learn how to speak about your work, not just what you've done, but why it's important, why it matters, what's the impact of that work. That's going to speak volumes to anything that you're applying for. And then lastly, as Nicole already said, start early. It's not always the writing that takes a ton of time, but it's the preparation of your grant, your work, and your program. So start early and reach out early. Have your applications reviewed, not just by our office, but by peers as well, as many people who are willing to look at it. You want that, even if it's negative criticism, you want that before it goes to the committee, because you want them to pick out that fatal flaw, but it doesn't really have any consequences rather than not getting funded. So just some general tips there. Okay, so now I'll go into the 3 different agencies and just tell you a bit about the programs that they offer. So the first is SSHRC, Social Science and Humanities, Arts and Humanities, and they have a few different streams that you can consider applying for. The first is the talent stream. This is for trainee scholarships and fellowships. Anything between undergraduate and postdoctoral researchers can get funded through SSHRC. And I actually should mention here, I probably should have mentioned this before, but there's a tri-agency campaign right now. It's starting this year, 2023 to 2024. And they're investing, I think it was like $40 or $50 million to supporting high quality Black scholars for the trainee scholarships and fellowships. So it's a really good time to apply. It's carrying through, I think, for the next 5 years with an additional $10 million. So if you are in the trainee stage, it's a really great time to apply for scholarships and fellowships. And this is not just for SSHRC, it's all tri-agency, all 3 councils. Then you have the Insight Grant, which is more kind of like their bread and butter. It's just to support any sort of research that goes to advancing work or knowledge in social science, arts, and humanities. And there's 2 streams. You have the Insight Development and Insight. The Insight Development is shorter term, less money, and a little bit more geared towards the early career researchers or established researchers that are trying something new, a new method, a new project, but it's short-term funding, 2 years maximum. Then you have the Insight, which is more stable long-term funding, and kind of, I think some people often work their way up to an Insight. So start with, you can correct me, right? That's right. That they can start with an Insight Development, get the project going, and then go up into the Insight Grant. Then you have the Connection. This is for knowledge mobilization, flow of knowledge, exchange of knowledge. And there's one grant called Connection, but there's 2 streams of it. And I always forget the names, outreach and events. Yeah. Outreach is for the longer, something like maybe a monthly podcast or something like that, just something that's more sustained over the tenure of the grant. And then the events is something that happens on a short term, like, a 3-day conference or something like that. But it's all geared towards knowledge mobilization. And then you have the partnerships, which kind of takes the mandates of all the others. So it's for knowledge advancement, for training, and for knowledge mobilization. But the caveat here is it's between you and some sort of external partner. 3 streams within partnership. You have the partnership and engage grants, which are the smallest. It's you and one non-academic partner, and the goals for the engage are more biased towards the partner as well as the outcome. Then you have the partnership development and the partnership grants, which are more multi-person team. It can include community partners, it can include academic partners, and it's kind of like Again, the same way insight development could lead to the insight, the partnership development can also lead to a partnership grant. The development kind of in its name helps you to develop your team, develop the work, possibly leading into the multi-million 7-year partnership grant. And when you're thinking of SSHRC, a typical trajectory, this is not the only way to run through the SSHRC program, but you can consider starting with an IDG, moving into an IG. When you finish kind of that base of your research, or you have at least a good start on it, you can consider expanding your network, doing something like the PDG, the partnership development, working into the partnership grant. And then I just listed the NFRF here as something large scale that you can think about, but there's multiple grants that you can do through this. Okay, so NSERC kind of does the same thing, has a few different streams. Develop is again for trainees, anywhere between undergrad to postdoctoral researchers. And then you have the Explore, because they're basic research, they're discovery-based research. And there's 3 main types of grants that you can do for NSERC. There's others, there's thematic calls and team calls, but these are the 3 main that don't really change. You have Discovery, which is really the flagship of NSERC. If you're in natural science and engineering, you're applying for the Discovery grant. It's kind of an unspoken rule. You apply for Discovery, it's stable funding for your program. If you need some sort of high-tech equipment, you apply to RTI, Research Tools and Instruments. And then the Create is a training grant. So it's a larger scale grant, multi-person grant, usually like teams of like 10, but it's really just for the training of your students or postdocs. And it has to have some sort of value add. So not just typical training in a lab, but includes some sort of knowledge mobilization, exchange of trainees, conferences. And it is quite large. If you're thinking about a Create, you would probably hire some like a program manager to help you run it. There's forms that need to go back to NSERC. So more on the larger side. And then the Innovate is more for partnerships. This can include academic partnerships, industrial partnerships, and it's all through the Alliance. A trajectory here looks like your Discovery, and I know I've listed Discovery twice, and that's just to say you are applying for the Discovery every 5 years. If it's your first time in a Discovery or your early career, you can think that it'll give you something around maybe 20 to 30,000 per year. But once you start to establish your work, it's not common, but it's not impossible to get to about like 100,000 per year. Again, once you have a good stable research, you can expand your network, do something like an alliance. Again, then keep going when you have these partnerships created, do something like a Create, ending off with an NFRF or something similar. Then for SSHRC, a bit more streamlined, 2 streams here, the training and the more operating grants. So within operating, there's project, there's operating grants, and there's also team grants. So if you click on these links, it'll bring you to a page where it lists them all. The operating team grants are more specific. So it deals with a certain area in health research. So for example, I saw today that there was a call for HIV, but the project is funding anything health research. They're not the easiest to get. And so when you're thinking of a trajectory for CIHR, I would suggest not starting with a project grant, but actually starting with a smaller grant that's still related to your research, getting your data together, getting some preliminary data, and then applying for the project grant. So just for example, in cancer research, and I mentioned the Cancer Research Society, it's a 2-year grant. I think it's like 60,000 a year. So you would start with something like that to build up your work and then move up to applying for a project grant. The project grant in itself can be quite large, but again, I've listed the NFRF. Okay, hand it off to Anna.
Okay, so then I'm gonna switch over to talking about how we might go about planning a research program in general. I want to state that it's very hard to generalize here. This is going to vary greatly depending on your field, your institution, and possibly your department. But I have kind of put together just some general suggestions that might get you thinking. Again, please take this with a big grain of salt and know that this might not apply, not all of this might apply to you. So if you are in a tenure track position and you are an early career researcher before tenure, probably what's going to guide your research the most pre-tenure is just doing what you need to get tenure. So the first thing you would want to do is figure out what you need to secure tenure. And that often comes with a 5-year plan, because not every institution's and location's tenure cycle is the same, but usually there is sort of a 5-year period. And questions you might want to ask yourself when you're starting your research program are, do you need external funding? What do you need the funding for? What grants can fund it? So to kind of really get a good sense of what are the most common funding sources, but also what are the less common funding sources that might be applicable to your particular field? What grants are you eligible for? So, that comes with researching the funding available. And you can also consider if any of these funding pools have money dedicated to early career researchers, if that applies to you. Do you have the necessary protocol approvals and just necessary approvals to carry out your research? Often you don't always need them when you're applying, but you will probably need them once you're funded to carry out your work. Do you need to recruit any personnel? This will, again, really vary depending on your field, but in some areas of research, you can't really function without like a lab full of personnel and possibly grad students. And finally, would you benefit from having collaborators? This might not be something that you would start out with right away, but if there could be a lot of benefits to having experienced collaborators or collaborators experienced in a very particular field that you might not have expertise in, and that might help you secure funding. And finally, not directly applicable to a research program plan, but applicable to your career in general is considering applying for awards or seeking awards nominations. This is not, again, it doesn't directly contribute to your research, but it contributes to the visibility of your work and your visibility as a scholar. It may help you, if you win an award, it may help you find more, graduate students. It might help you secure collaborations. So it's something to consider as you're building your research program, and don't let it totally fall to the wayside. Okay, so I tried to provide an outline of what a 5-year plan may look like. Again, please take this with a very big grain of salt. It will depend on your field. But say you are in the social sciences and humanities, and again, I know it's wrong to totally group them together. There's wide variation. But for example, say for your tenure, you need a book manuscript and maybe some articles published. So for the 5-year period, so you will start out with working on your book manuscript. You may also start out by starting to work on your first article. If it makes sense for you to recruit students for the work, you might start recruiting students at this point. You may also seek out support in mentoring students. If you don't have a lot of experience with mentorship at this stage, you might want to seek out resources to help you with that. And again, depending on your situation, you may need funding. So you would apply for grants. The IDG would be an appropriate one as you're starting your projects because it supports early stage work. The IG may also be appropriate depending on the stage of the work that you're trying to seek funding for. Although it's maybe not always appropriate at early stages, the connection grant is something to consider because so you can use it for knowledge mobilization in terms of sort of outreach, but you can also use it just to fund meetings and events and workshops. And finally, the CONOT New Researcher Award is one that U of T researchers commonly apply for. The success rates are pretty high, even for researchers in their first year or faculty in their first year. So I would highly recommend applying for that. And your second year, you might continue, working on your book manuscript. Maybe you would put out a second article. If you have, sorry, there is a typo on the slide. MSc is not appropriate, but if you have a master's student, they might be graduating now. You might continue to recruit students. You may continue to apply for grants. Similar with third year, perhaps you will have PhD students at this stage. Perhaps they will be graduating in year 4. And in year 4 and year 5, you would continue with this. But in year 5, presumably you would be doing revisions on your book. Maybe you would have switched to a new project now and have a second project going. And for the grants you're applying for, you might consider switching the grant mechanisms now that you've built up sort of a foundation for your research. you might consider applying for partnerships and partnership grants. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't apply for partnership grants earlier on. It just might be easier to focus on kind of individual work that will kind of get you rewarded more as an individual, rather than, you know, partnership work, which is very rewarding, but has a lot of labor, and usually it's sort of a team grant application. This work should be more rewarded, but, you know, depending on your tenure requirements, it might just not make sense to apply for it earlier. And so I came up with something similar for the sciences. Again, this will also vary throughout STEM, you know, because research programs and generating research results can really vary from field to field. But so in your first year, you will probably apply for an NSERC discovery grant, unless it really doesn't make sense for your work. And that's because NSERC discovery is sort of the foundational grant in Canada for many of the sciences. And you might also apply for a Connaught New Researcher Award. You will probably be recruiting students, and you might also look to network to start to find collaborators for your work. In years 2 and 3, you know, you might be graduating your master's students. And you might also start to look to publishing your first article. So as you know, publications tend to be very important. I've seen advice that you should kind of have an article or manuscript in the pipeline every year, like 1 a year. That may not be realistic, that might not be applicable to your field, but it's something to consider. You just kind of want to have a steady output of published research. Later on, you might also consider applying for a CIHR project grant. And again, I'm not saying you can't apply in your first year. They just tend to favor work where there's a lot of preliminary data. And so it might be difficult to secure them, you know, earlier on. And yeah, finally, you'll probably be applying for grants. I mean, hopefully not every year, but fairly continuously, and you'll probably be continuously recruiting students, publishing articles, and around year 5, you might graduate your first PhD student. So on the topic of finding resources to help you with student mentorship, I did find that U of T, the School of Graduate Studies at U of T does have some documents, some resources, some advice on this, and I will send out the link after the presentation. But they have checklists that will help you consider, you know, how you want to go about mentorship. So, you know, things to do to establish a collegial environment, or things you will undertake in your mentoring activities. And it also helps you work through what kind of mentorship style you think you will have. So this is just a screenshot, but I will send you the resources for this. Now I'm going to hand it over to Stephanie to talk about grantsmanship.
Yeah, so I'm going to go through again. I'm going to start off a bit more high level, things that may relate to awards, to all councils, all agencies, and then I'll go a bit more in detail into the 3 different agencies and some tips and tricks for those. So firstly, the first thing I want to say that's really important is just to take the instructions seriously. That's basically my job, is to make sure that you've fulfilled all the requirements of that grant or that application, and it should be something that you should be doing as well. For any grant, any award, any scholarship that you're applying for, they have some sort of list of criteria that you need to fill, some sort of requirement that you need to speak to. They also often have a peer review manual or some sort of rubric that you can refer to and make sure you're answering all their questions. So, you know, don't think if you can just glaze over one and do really well in another section. When it goes to external committees, they have to answer, they have to score you on all those criteria. So it's really important that you satisfy all the different criteria that is being asked of you. Then once you get down to the writing, I think also clarity and organization play a big part on, I mean, it's not going to take bad research and make it fundable, but definitely if you're not clear and you're not organized, it can take good research and make it unfundable. So a couple notes on that. So clarity, use leading phrases, something like the goal of this project is, and then bold really important sections of the detailed description so that it highlights the important parts. You're kind of guiding the reader to the important parts of your application, and this helps readers or reviewers refer back to, you know, when they're reading through 10s and 20s of these all at once. Again, the organization plays a big part on the readability of your work. So use the same language that's in the call. So if they're specifically asking for objectives, methods, aims, whatever, have those as subheadings. Again, bold, important phrases. So that just helps to guide the reader. I went to an information session a couple weeks ago where they were talking about this idea of editing down to one. And I thought it was a really nice way of kind of thinking about your work. So it's the idea of one major goal per application, one concept per paragraph, one thought per sentence. And this may result in shorter paragraphs, but that's also not a bad thing. Having some white space, again, makes for an easier read. You can just put yourself in the position of that reviewer, that they have the stack of applications to run through. And when you have 5 pages of, mini text squished together, it's really hard to get through that. It's exhausting. So making it easy and kind of jumping to the next point is making it a joy to read. You don't want to have any sort of negative thoughts in the reviewer's head when it's not even the research. It's just, if it's hard to read, it's going to leave a negative impression. Skipping back then, don't underestimate the value of a good summary and the first paragraph in your detailed proposal. So the summary is the first thing that the reviewers read. They use this to kind of get an impression of the work. They also use it to refer back to your work. So once they've read the work, they've made their evaluation, then they come to the peer review committee, they're going to reread your summary, and it's going to kind of remind them what the work is about. So the summary is actually really important. And it also helps to determine your evaluation committee when there's something like a registration or a letter of intent, notice of intent. So don't underestimate your summary. Write it in easy to understand terms. So intelligent lay. Don't make it very technical. Don't make it too specific. Something that everybody can enjoy and appreciate what you're trying to say in there. The summary should answer the who, what, where, when, how sort of questions, but in an easy to read format. And then the same thing with that leading paragraph. So the first paragraph of your detailed proposal, I always suggest starting with the problem and the impact of that problem. So why is it important? Not just this is what I'm going to do, but this is why I need to do it. This is who it's going to affect. This is going to be the impact of the work. Then you can kind of describe, once I set the stage for the problem, this is how I'm going to address it. And then you can get into the rest of the technical stuff. But that first paragraph kind of does the same thing as the summary. It compels the reader to want to learn more. They need to appreciate the work right off the bat, or they're not going to want to read the rest of the 10 pages. And then lastly, put together a consistent and cohesive application. And I have some resources that I'll show you in a second, but you don't want the reviewers to be surprised by anything. So all the different sections of the applications should speak to each other, whether that means the proposal speaks to the budget, to the KD plan, anything like that, but they should all be intertwined so that there's no surprises at any time. Okay, so some specific tips for CIHR. Keep in mind, again, I think I already mentioned this, but they do have, the project grant has pretty low success rates. I think it's somewhere between like 12 to maybe 20%, maybe not even maximum, but they are hard to get. And this is why I suggested not starting off with a project grant, starting off with something smaller to help you build up your pilot data, your preliminary data, and as well as your team, if that makes sense. If you need some sort of expertise to help you complete the project and the project goals, make sure you have those people on board and have strong collaborations with them before you apply. Usually CIHR wants to see at least 1, but better, 2 years of strong preliminary data that kind of guarantees the success of that project. Somebody said to me a while ago, he was an established researcher, did a lot of committee work for CIHR, saying that CIHR only funds work that's already done. And while it's kind of comical to think of it in that way, it's not wrong. Like they want a successful project already going. When you're thinking about the funding level, a good tip is to look at what's been previously funded. So look at your discipline, look at your stage and see what they've funded in the past and use that as kind of a target. It doesn't have to stay exactly in that number, but that'll kind of define the range and where you should be asking for funding. EDI and training is really important to all agencies, but especially for CIHR, they have a training module that you have to complete. You get a certificate and then you have to upload it to your application. So don't leave that to the last second, because you do need to show this to even be considered for a project grant. The priority announcements, again, is a really important thing to know about. So with a low level of funding from CIHR, they have something called priority announcements or more specific calls. And if your research falls within one of these priority announcements, make sure to address this on your project grant. It's not a separate application. It's within the project grant itself. It's like a additional half a page of relevance. But what happens is that once they finish their funding for the full project grants, they start funding at a lower rate. I think it's 1 year at maybe, $100,000 to fund these priority announcements. So as long as you have over a 3.5 in your CHR score, you can be considered for this kind of bridge funding. We'll just give you that extra year to build up your work and then reapply for the project grant.
Yeah.
And then the last thing for CHR, but I think this can be said for all kind of agencies, is never to resubmit the same proposal. If you haven't been funded the first time you apply, take the criticism seriously, address that criticism, build up that work, and resubmit something that's better, essentially, right? You have about 3 tries. I would say, I mean, that's not a hard and fast rule, but you have about 3 tries with the same idea, with the same kind of goal, until you're not going to be perceived well by the committee anymore. Then you're just going to be starting to give your name a bad reputation. So make sure to address all those comments. And if by the 3rd or 4th time you haven't gotten it, you might want to reconsider the project. Okay, so then the same sort of tips for NSERC, again, focusing on the discovery grant. The most important thing you need to know about the discovery is that it funds a program and not a project, and leave out the word project if you're ever writing for the discovery. It sounds silly, but don't call them projects. Reviewers are looking for ways to kind of triage applications. So instead of talking about a project, talk about an aim. I've heard it was a thrust, which kind of sounds strange, but talk about it as something other than, I know it was a weird word to use, but they got funded. So don't use project. It's supposed to support the program, so the overarching goal of your research. It's referred to as a grant in aid, which means it's not going to be enough to support your research, and you can apply for other grants as well, as long as there's no budgetary overlap. Conceptual overlap is okay, but you can't ask for $10,000 to fund a graduate student when you're asking for the same money from a different agency to fund that same graduate student. As I said about the summary, the LOI is securing your evaluation committee. And so with any grant that has some sort of LOI, NOI registration phase where they ask for a summary, the point of that is to secure your evaluation committee. So a good tip there is to take a look. They're usually posted online. Take a look at who the reviewers are and make sure you're applying to the right committee, or you're asking for the right committee, because this can have a huge impact on how much you get funded. If the people don't understand your work or can not appreciate your work, you're not going to be funded by that committee. One good tip of knowing that you're in the right committee is if you recognize the names there. That's usually a good hint that you're in the right, or you're asking for the right committee. Something I think a bit unique about the discovery is that the 3 sections that you're being evaluated on are equally weighted. So a lot of people tend to focus just on the proposal, but especially, I think this is true for most grants, but especially for the discovery, if you're not focusing as well as the excellence of the researcher, as well as training and EDI, you're not going to pass the discovery, or you're going to be in a really low funding bin. So it's really important to make sure you're focusing on all 3 equally. And something to say about EDI, now that we're in 2023, 2024 year, it's not enough to say, I have a gender balanced lab, I have racially minorized people in my lab. You have to target, you have to find a specific barrier in your discipline. You have to say why it's important, you have to identify that barrier, and then very specific ways that you will address that barrier and have an implementation plan. So again, it's not enough just to say gender balanced, we're all good here. You have to have really specific and concrete plans at this stage. I already talked about using the merit indicators, their rubrics, their peer review guides. I know for a fact NSERC, and I think all agencies do this, but NSERC has everything for free to look at, see what you're going to be evaluated on, and use it. Make sure you take a look and see what they're asking for, because as I said before, if you're not addressing criteria, it could be that fatal flaw. And then with the budget, it's not really important with NSERC. You're not going to be funded at what you ask for. So the funding with NSERC works in bins. So however you get rated, if you're exceptional in all 3 of these criteria, you'll be in the highest bin. If you get a strong in one of them, you'll be in a lower bin and you'll get less money. But one quick thing to say about the budget is that you won't get more than what you ask for. So even if you're in the highest bin and you only ask for 10,000, you'll only get 10,000. And also if you're asking for like, 500,000 a year, that kind of raises a red flag to reviewers because that's not what the application is about. So ask for what you need, but don't be surprised if you don't get it. And then for SSHRC, so just some tips generally about SSHRC. I think something important with CIHR, at least I'm not hugely, I don't have a ton of experience with SSHRC, but what I heard from some colleagues recently is to really curate your research trajectory. And that kind of means not shooting every window that kind of flies by your windows, every bird that flies by your window. Really focus on, as Anna said, what's going to get you to tenure, and then you can start expanding. So you can be involved in partnership grants, as Anna said, but make sure your base is off to a good start. Get to know, SSHRC has a lot of different streams, get to know the different streams and the different calls, because as I said before, a really easy way to triage an application is if it doesn't fit the mandate. So, don't get stuck writing an application that it doesn't fit the call. And all SSHRC applications, anyone that you apply for, you're going to be based on these three criteria: challenge, feasibility, and capability. The challenge is how well you are able to showcase your problem, give the context of it. Feasibility is a plan to address that problem, and then the capability is you and your team and why you are the best person to address that. One note about the challenge, same as the CIHR priority announcements, SSHRC has these, I think they're called future calls. And if you can frame your work within one of these future calls, you'll often fare better. I mean, it's not that if it's not in this work, you won't get a SSHRC grant, but if you can somehow frame your work within one of these future calls, you might do a bit better on one of their grant applications. And then the last thing to say about SSHRC is that all parts of the application matter. Unlike NSERC, where the budget didn't really mean much, in SSHRC it does, and it actually means quite a bit. So this is just an example for the SSHRC Insight Grant. So you can see the three different criteria that all their grants use to evaluate your work. What you'll notice between the grants is that their weightage kind of differs. So this is for the Insight, where the capability is a bit higher, whereas in the IDG, where it's more geared towards ECR, early career researchers, that's a bit lower because they just haven't had the time to build themselves up as much. But you'll always see these three different criteria, depending on the weight and also where they pull that information from. So for the Insight and the challenge, you're looking at the summary, the detailed description, and the outcomes, and the rest as you see there. But the one thing I wanted to say here is in feasibility, the budget justification, whereas in the other ones didn't really matter much. For SSHRC, if they feel that 30% or more of your budget is unjustified, you can fail right there. It doesn't matter how great the rest of your work is. If you fail in the budget, you fail overall. They function on this idea of minimal essential funding. So that's just to say, don't be frivolous with your money. Don't schedule 5 research trips to the same place in California where you can do it all in one. Ask for what you need. Don't sell yourself short, but don't be, a crazy spender.
So I'm just going to give a few more tips on some of the most common SSHRC grant mechanisms. So the Insight Development Grant, it's, as Stephanie already kind of discussed. Oh, sorry, I think something got switched. Okay, this is supposed to be for the Insight Grant, I apologize. So the Insight Grant is the most flexible SSHRC funding opportunity. It supports both short and long-term projects, so the length is between 2 and 5 years. And it's for any subject under SSHRC's mandate. It supports both emerging and established scholars. The one thing to remember is that international co-applicants are not allowed for this grant mechanism. It's different for the IDG, and I will touch on that later. Evaluation is, as Stephanie discussed, 40% weighted on challenge, 20% feasibility, 40% capability. And the grants are assessed first by external assessors who will make comments on the grant. And then this is shared with committees who will take the assessments into account, but they're not necessarily bound by them. So keep in mind that your proposal will be read by experts, but then it will also be looked at by a committee who might not all be, completely in your field. So just consider that. And for the Insight Development Grant, it supports early stage research, although it supports both emerging and established scholars. It may involve, but is not limited to, case studies, pilot initiatives, and critical analyses of existing research. It does allow international co-applicants, unlike the Insight grant. And as Stephanie mentioned, there is a bit more of a focus on challenge, a bit less on capability. So a bit less of a focus on the previous sort of work and experience of the researcher. And the other difference is that the IBG has a single stage adjudication committee. So there's not going to be an external assessor, it's just going to go to the committee. So make sure, you know, I think you could even like look up committee membership and write for the committee and consider who's going to be in it. And sorry, I'm going to pass it back to Stephanie.
So when I was talking about the general tips of keeping your research plan cohesive and consistent throughout, there's some really simple ways of doing this to keep you on track. And it's just, you know, making something up in Excel, something like this to help you just lay out your research plan and then write based on what you have on this sheet. So this is just something that I did in Excel. You can kind of tailor it to your needs, but you would have something like your project objectives, you know, the project objectives here, write out exactly what that aim is and in what years you'll be tackling it. So this one I just laid out a 5-year plan, but if it's only a 2-year, kind of using it like a Gantt chart. As well, if it's a team grant, what skill do you need? Who is that member? This is all just fillable data where you would put your own information in. And again, what years would they be coming into play? The research output is when you would be expecting, in this column here, when you would be expecting, say, an article, a book, some sort of conference, some sort of, you know, deliverable from your research plan. And again, make sure to stipulate the year. Same thing with the trainees. Collaborations and resources as needed. So if you need outside resources, if you need outside collaborators or partnerships, again, listing as many as you need and in what years you'll be using that. That way, even before you start writing, you can have this in front of you, you can shape your proposal around it, and then you can also use it to develop your budget so that you haven't forgotten anything. So, you know, you're not throwing in a piece of equipment in the budget when you haven't spoken about it in your proposal at all. This is just another way of doing it. I prefer Excel because it allows you to give a timeline as well. But if you like to write a little bit more, you can do something like this in Word where it has some space here to provide some justification or some notes. Okay, so I think partnerships and collaborations is the last thing we're going to talk about. And that one weird. I feel like I'm missing something here. Maybe, I don't know. Anyway, so a few tips about planning partnerships. So the first thing is to try to identify a suitable partner, which I think is the hardest part of partnerships. But when you're thinking about partners, think about someone who has an overlapping goal. Somebody who would be dedicated to like co-creating the proposal with you, someone who's invested in the outcome and invest in that outcome. Spend some time planning your knowledge mobilization and the deliverables of that project. And there's some links here. When we send out the slides, you'll be able to click on them, but there's someone named Melanie Barwick at the Hospital for Sick Children. She's an implementation researcher, which she studies how to show the impact of a partnership or work. And she has some tools that are really helpful. So the first one is a template. You can use this even before planning a partnership or even just planning your research program. It's just a checklist going over what you might need, what kind of support you need, what kind of impact, what kind of audience. And you can just go through and check off and then start planning your partnership. Then the other one is the appraisal tool. So once you actually have a plan down, you just use it to see if there's any weak links, anything that you've missed. So to access those, they're free. You just need to put in your email address and then you'll be given those tools. We also have developed in-house. This will hopefully go on the website soon, but if not, you can email me if you're interested. There's, we put together this document that is, I think, pretty cohesive, comprehensive. I think I tried my hardest to look at all the different partnership grants that were out there. It's separated by disciplines at the bottom, so you can just go to what you're interested in. And the opportunities that are available for partnership grants. This is both community, academic, and industry. And then the last thing to say is that there are people to help. So on site at UTM, we have our partnership manager, Raquel D'Souza. She can help at all stages of partnership development, as early on as, helping you maybe find a partner or a discussion with your partner, and then also helps with the application stage as well. And then more on the social science, arts and humanities side, there's Stephen Hermans and RSO, who was referred to since I got here as like, you know, the partnership developing God. Shows everything there is to know about partnership grants in social science, arts and humanities. So, you know, if you're planning one of these, reach out to us and we can get you in conversation with Stephen and you know, help you plan that. And I think Anna has one last thing to say.
One last quick thing. So Stephen Hermans and his office have developed documents to help you with planning partnership grants. These are just sort of screenshots of them. There are checklists for the partnership development and partnership grant. And there are also milestone documents to help you plan out the grant preparation process. And we can also send these out or please contact us if you're interested in receiving them. And finally, that's it. Thank you for your attention. Our contact information is up there. And the ways to connect with OVPR are there, but you will also receive our contact information.